It's Amina.
And it's Ghada. Welcome back to Jetlag Politics, the podcast where we deep dive into the political forces shaping our world. Today, we are tackling a topic that's been on everyone's mind: Trump 2.0. What would the second Trump presidency mean for the world, and especially for the Middle East? Buckle up, because this is going to be a fascinating ride.
Absolutely, Rada. Trump's first term was already a seismic shift in US foreign policy, but a second term could take things even further if that's possible. So let's break it down. What does Trump want? Spoilers, I don't think we can figure that out just yet. And how might his policies reshape the Middle East and the global order?
Yes, and let's start with the shift in doing politics that Trump brings with him. And as I understand, most of it is outlined in his Project 2025. Reading that will really give you an idea of where this is going. Can you tell us about that, Amina?
Yes. So, with the election of Donald Trump, we have witnessed a marked shift towards what political scientists term clientelistic politics. It's a transactional dynamic where political loyalty is exchanged for specific favors or benefits and vice versa. And we'll talk more about why the direction of why those favors flow doesn't matter so much in the last stages of capitalism. To me, this shift evokes parallels to the Ancien Régime of pre revolutionary France, where powers and privilege were concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy elite, while the broader populace was largely excluded from meaningful political representation. In the contemporary US context, this manifests as a system increasingly dominated by a handful of billionaires who wield outsized influence over policy and governance, effectively steering the political apparatus to serve their private interests. Much like pre revolutionary French aristocracy, this modern elite appears to operate under the logic of self enrichment and patronage, raising profound questions about the erosion of democratic ideals and the growing inequalities within the political system.
And even when we just stop at the language, and I haven't seen anybody analyzing this one, but the language and the rhetoric used by Donald Trump reveals a striking shift in how he conceptualizes governance and foreign policy. Not as a head of state, but as a CEO running a business. He often described US allies like South Korea and Japan as clients who should pay more for the services of the American military protection, or even referred to NATO members as delinquent on their payments, framing their defense spending commitments as if they were overdue invoices.
Exactly. This language reduces complex international alliances to a simplistic ledger of debt and payments, ignoring the strategic, historical, and moral dimensions of collective security. This vocabulary shift, as you pointed out, Rada, is not just stylistic, it reflects a fundamentally transactional and profit driven approach to politics that undermine traditional diplomatic norms and the role of the nation state.
Yes, and one would ask if this is what late capitalism is. We as collective are currently living through a historical moment. I don't know if it is good news or bad news. You decide on that one for yourself. We are talking extreme wealth concentration, the erosion of public institutions, and the commodification of nearly every aspect of life. Does anybody own anything anymore with all the subscriptions? The rise of globalized markets, financialization, and the dominance of multinational corporations have created the system where economic and political power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of few billionaires and corporate entities.
And we see how this has led to growing inequalities, the hollowing out of the middle class, and the weakening of democratic institutions. For the United States, this has manifested in a political system that is increasingly transactional and clientelistic, where policy decisions are shaped by the interests of wealthy donors, as we've seen in this last election, rather than the needs of the broader population, often at the expense of states' sovereignty. Globally, this has resulted in a race to the bottom in terms of labor rights, environmental regulations, and tax policies as nations compete to attract corporate investment.
And the political conduct of figures like Donald Trump and Elon Musk poses a significant threat to the very notion of the nation state. And you brushed on that earlier, Amina. Where do we see that manifesting? And can you start by defining the role of nation state for our audience?
So, traditionally, the nation state has been the primary unit of political organization responsible for maintaining sovereignty, providing public goods, and ensuring the welfare of citizens. However, the increasing influence of private sector actors and the erosion of public institutions are undermining these functions. With Trump in power, we are seeing some signs of disruption to the system. And I think he's very proud of that. For example, there is a move to further privatization of public functions such as student loan management or even veteran health administration. He's also, that's today, signed a new executive order expanding the power over independent agencies, further concentrating power in his hands. And we've seen someone else do that in Germany in the 30s. But just as alarming, perhaps, is the erosion of sovereignty through things like the prioritization of corporate influence over policy. And we see Trump's reliance on his son in law, Jared Kushner, a real estate developer with no real diplomatic experience to manage key foreign policy initiatives. He's even named Jared's father who is a convicted felon, ambassador to France. Not to mention how Doge is shaping up to be more of an instrument of vendetta for for Elon Musk, sorry, against the
Trump.
administration that sorry,
And Trump.
and Trump is just two faces of the same coin, against the administration that he or they believe have wronged them rather than something that serves the American people. And again, with someone like Musk and other wealthy men in Trump's circle, we are witnessing corporate interests running over national interests. I mean, just last week, there is a government contract to purchase $400 million worth of Tesla Cybertrucks, which is a conflict of interest.
Obviously, Amina. And I think we can add to the list lobbying and dark money tainting public interests, like with IPAC, Big Pharma, insurance, the military industry. And just last week, and again, sorry for overusing this example, but there is just a wealth of it, was awarded a $38 million contract for SpaceX. Speak
Uh,
about conflict of interest again.
yes, yes. Eggs, by the way, are now $15 a cart, but this won't matter when we colonize Mars. But we also see his daily bypassing of Congress, arguably anti constitutional, making us wonder if there is or there should be a cap on the number of executive orders a sitting president can issue in a week. Yeah. We also have to talk about the attacks on the judiciary and media, though the media kind of deserves it. His repeated attacks on the Department of Justice, essentially labeling it entirely corrupt, is to me the most dangerous because when you cast doubt over the judicial system, you erode one of the pillars of a society.
It is dangerous, Amina, and perhaps this is why they are currently operating like they are above any law. Trump has declared he who saved his country does not violate any law, and we have yet to see what he's saving it from. It's now essentially the laws of the jungle, and I wish that was a metaphor and I was exaggerating. It has become, I mean, it always has been like this, albeit with thicker gloves, about the superiority of brute force and self interest, or in other words, the rule of the one that can cause the most damage to the rest of the world. We can see a lot of people still calling out those who didn't vote for Kamala for being the cause of all of this. I mean, we know that it is not reasonable, or it is not a reasonable claim because of the crushing victory of Donald Trump that would have made no difference in the outcome. But we can't help but wonder how things would have been different. And while the presidency represents a stark escalation of clientelistic politics and the influence of billionaire elites, it is important to recognize that this phenomenon did not emerge in a vacuum.
Indeed, Trump is in many ways the consequence of decades of poor governance, private sector meddling, and the erosion of public trust in institutions, a process that unfolded under both Republican and Democratic administrations. So, Kamala Harris, as a product of the same political establishment, would likely have continued many of these trends, prioritizing incrementalism and maintaining the status quo over real fundamental transformative change. And if anything, Trump, in my opinion, is holding up a mirror to the crumbling face of progressive policies. If they were well rooted and strong, they wouldn't be so easy to dismantle. I mean, he's only been in office for a few weeks now. So those currently insulting people for not voting for Kamala can give it a rest and need to understand that Trump's rise is not an aberration, but a symptom of a system that has long allowed private interests to overshadow public needs and set the stage for a uh, for politics of transactional relationships and elite capture.
I can't agree more, Amina. And now let's talk about the Middle East. Trump's first term was marked by a break from decades of US policy in the region, from the Abraham Accords to initiating the withdrawal of the US troops from the region. Trump redefined America's role in the Middle East. But what would a second term look like, according to you?
Well, one thing is clear, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but it's important to understand that Trump's approach to the Middle East is also transactional and often dismissive of longstanding norms. Take the Israeli Palestinian conflict, for example. Trump's so called deal of the century effectively sidelined the two-state solution, which has long been the cornerstone of international diplomacy for decades. Instead, his plan favored the Israeli annexation of large parts of the West Bank and the Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, all in complete disregard for international law, of course, and for the precedent that it is establishing for future wannabe invaders.
And Amina, let's not forget the implications of that approach. By legitimizing the Israeli settlements and ignoring Palestinian aspirations for statehood, Trump's policies have alienated not just Palestinians, but also key US allies in the region like Jordan and Egypt. Both countries have long standing peace treaties with Israel, but they've also been vocal about the need for a just resolution to the Palestinian issue. Trump's disregard for their concerns has strained these relationships and diminished the trust of the regional powers in the role of the US as a mediator.
Exactly. And it's not just about diplomacy. Trump's policies have also emboldened extremism. And Ghada and I have extensively explored this in two previous podcasts on the rise of fascism, but also on the causes of October 7th being directly tied to Trump's policies. And we mean here the Abraham Accords. By dismissing the two-state solution and pushing for a reality where forced displacement of the Palestinians is seen as a solution, Trump is essentially endorsing a policy that many consider both illegal and immoral. And this approach only undermines US credibility.
There. With that being said, Amina, we can perceive his plan for Gaza as a continuation of the same approach, even though his most recent rhetoric around Gaza has been particularly alarming. He's floated the idea of treating Gaza as a personal real estate project ethnically cleansing Palestinians and turning it into luxury Riviera. Not only this idea is a blatant violation of international law, but it also ignores the humanitarian catastrophe that such a move would create.
And let's talk about the regional fallout. Trump's pressure on Arab allies like Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to accept these kinds of solutions is deeply problematic for Jordan, for example, which already hosts a large number of Palestinian refugees, and Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza. These policies are a direct threat to their national security, so forcing them to accept that what amounts to ethnic cleansing is not just immoral, and now we're being called naive and old-fashioned for speaking on what's moral, but it's a recipe for instability. There is a big underestimation by Trump here of the people of these countries. You may be able to bend their leaders, but you won't be able to bend the people who will not stand by. And where does that lead?
Exactly. I mean, Trump's policies could speed up the collapse of the Sykes-Picot states, those fragile nation states carved up by the Western powers after World War I. We're talking here about Jordan, uh, uh, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Take Jordan, for example. It's a country where Palestinians already make up a huge portion of the population. Some say they even outnumber Jordanians. If Trump pushes for policies that force more Palestinians into Jordan, it could tip the delicate demographic balance, sparking international tensions and potentially leading to the country's collapse. And then, if we take Lebanon, where we are talking about 500,000 Palestinians who live in Lebanon having the status of refugees, if Trump insists on settling these Palestinians in Lebanon, this can further shrink the Christian population and it would destabilize the fragile sectarian setup. These aren't just hypotheticals, these are real risks that could unravel the region, creating more failed states and chaos. But I must emphasize here that Trump's suggestion is not a creative, out of the box idea. This is the known and well documented plan of the far right Zionists to ethnically cleanse and forcibly displace the Palestinians in order to liquidate the Palestinian cause for good.
And let's not forget the broader implications. Fighting with Canada, Mexico, Panama, and sending the vice president to Europe to publicly, on their soil, call them pathetic. By alienating traditional allies and empowering extremism, Trump's policies risk creating a vacuum that other powers like China are eager to fill. So now let's shift our focus to Trump's relationship with international institutions. These are the organizations that have been the backbone of international cooperation since World War II. So think the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the ICC, and the ICJ. But under Trump, the US took a step back, or in some cases, a full on retreat.
Exactly. So let's break it down. First, there is UN Human Rights Council, which signals the disregard of Trump's America to the very notion of human rights and its withdrawal from the human rights leadership. Trump also pulled funding from UNRWA, claiming it was mismanaged and biased. However, critics saw this as an attack on the right to return of the Palestinian refugees and another step towards liquidating the Palestinian cause.
Also, Trump sanctioned the International Criminal Court after issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his former defense minister. This kind of hostility towards institutions that hold countries accountable for human rights violations sends a clear message. The US is not interested in playing by the rules of the international system that it helped create. Also, I'm having a moment of extreme self awareness here, which I don't recommend these days, but I am a little disturbed by the trend in which we find ourselves participating, in which we, through the language, in which we give him more power than he has. like Trump sanctioned, alienated, did this, did that. To me, it's like an implicit admission that there is no more system through which his power is checked and then disseminated. And that is the very definition of an emperor.
And it isn't only about withdrawing support from international organizations. Trump also proposed massive cuts to USAID, the agency responsible for the US foreign aid and development assistance. USAID has long been a tool of American soft power, and by slashing its budget, Trump weakened one of the most effective ways the US promoted its values around the world.
Yeah, and then there is again, going back to the World Health Organization, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump cut ties with the World Health Organization, accusing it of being too close to China and mishandling the crisis. This move left a huge gap in global health leadership at the worst possible time. In his first day back in office for his second term, he initiated the procedure for withdrawal from the World Health Organization, pausing the future transfer of any US governmental funds, support, or resources to it. This month, we also have the confirmation of Robert Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, who is notoriously anti vaccine. He says they cause autism, and who is now advocating for the state to control abortion, which he didn't used to. But aside from the World Health Organization, Rada, you mentioned the UNHCR, and Trump is also pulling out of UNESCO. Now, people may have a lot of criticism about how the aid and international development sectors programs are run. I am one of them. But such decisions indicate that Trump and his friends are either ignorant of the negative ramification for the US this will have, or this is just blind demagoguery, which is even worse for America. And here you'll notice we're not even talking about the rest of the world anymore because we know that it doesn't matter to Trump and friends. Now, let's talk about how Trump treated America's closest allies. And no spoilers here, as we all know that it wasn't all warm and fuzzy.
Take trade, for example. Trump imposed tariffs on allies like Canada, the European Union, and Mexico, arguing that trade deficits were hurting the US economy. He renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, which did bring some updates, but the process was messy and strained relationships with key partners.
Yeah, and then there's NATO. Trump repeatedly criticized NATO members for not spending enough on defense, even threatening to pull the US out of the alliance. So, sure, some allies weren't meeting their targets, but publicly berating them it undermines trust in a partnership that's been the bedrock for transatlantic security for decades. And here is the irony. Uh, NATO's current legitimacy stems from tensions the US helped create. After the Cold War, America pushed NATO's expansion eastwards into Poland, the Baltics, and even floating Ukraine and Georgia, actions that Russia saw as direct threats. So this fueled hostilities between Europe and Russia, making NATO indispensable.
Now, for Trump to undermine NATO and act like it is Europe's problem ignores history. The US played a central role in shaping the security landscape that makes NATO vital today. Abandoning it doesn't just weaken Europe, it weakens America too. If Trump understood the 20th century, he'd known that NATO isn't just a European burden, it is an American legacy. Whether it is a negative or a positive one, that's debatable. But if you don't see a use of for NATO anymore, you should at least work on positively closing the chapter of ideologically fueled hostilities. And I mean, now talk a little bit about the most recent development involving Ukraine and Russia and how Trump's approach continues to stir controversy. As we know, the war in Ukraine has been a defining crisis of the past 2 years, with Russia's invasion in 2022 drawing widespread condemnation and a unified Western response. But Trump's stance on the conflict has been anything but conventional.
That's right. Trump has repeatedly claimed that he could end the war in 24 hours if he were in office, though he's been very vague about the specifics. But one particularly eyebrow raising suggestion he made recently was about Ukraine's rare minerals. Trump suggested that the US should take 50% of Ukraine's rare mineral resources as part of a deal to resolve the conflict. Now, for context, Ukraine is rich in critical minerals like lithium, which are essential for everything from electronic vehicles to advanced technology.
Yes, and this proposal has sparked a lot of debate. On one hand, some argue that leveraging Ukraine's resources could be a way to offset the cost of the US support or even fund reconstruction efforts. But critics see it as an exploitative, essentially treating Ukraine's natural wealth as a bargaining chip rather than respecting its sovereignty. It also raises questions about whether Trump's approach to foreign policy is transactional to a fault, prioritizing economic gains over principles like self determination and international law. I mean, I say here it raises questions, but I think the conclusion is very, very obvious on this one.
Yeah, it just solidifies it. And
Yeah.
again, like with everything else he does, there are overlooked broader implications. So, if the US were to push for a deal that involves carving up Ukraine's resources, we know, by the way, we know now that Zelensky has rejected the deal, but things can still change. It could undermine the moral high ground that the West has tried to maintain in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. It could also embolden other nations to pursue similar resource grabs in conflict zones, setting a dangerous precedent for global stability. And I'm afraid we're gonna see that soon.
Yeah. And so, what does this all mean for the world order? Trump's first term already challenged the rule based international systems that's been in place since World War II or World War One. Actually, if we want to be specific, a second term could take this even further.
Some are even starting to talk about a third term now. But by undermining international institutions, alienating allies, and embracing authoritarian leaders, Trump is eroding the foundations of the global order. This isn't just about the Middle East, it's about the future of multilateralism and international cooperation.
Yeah, and I mean, some argue that Trump's approach forced allies to take more responsibility for their own security and economic interests. And sure, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the long term consequences of his policies could be a more fragmented, less stable world order, one where cooperations on global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and human rights becomes even harder. And here is the big question: is this a necessary shakeup, exposing the flaws of a system that's long overdue for reform? Or is it a dangerous disruption that could lead to a more fragmented and less stable world?
No matter how I try to look at it, I always am drawn back to addressing the flawed foundation of the current world order. I know that with the rise of fascist rhetoric, we are seeing many people references the period of time that led to World War II. But I think that the crumbling of global norms can be traced back to the early 20th century, particularly the decisions made after World War One. Actually, I will even go as far as to say that there are many parallels that can be drawn between now and the lead up to World War One, but we want that to be another podcast for another day. So, take, for example, the rejection of Japan's 1919 proposal for racial equality at Versailles. Western imperial powers shut it down, entrenching a global hierarchy that prioritized white supremacy over fairness. This alienated non Western nations and fostered long term resentment that's bubbling up right now. Do we do we ever stop to wonder why alliances between ethnically different powers are so rare? It's worth asking why these historical and cultural barriers still dominate in a supposedly globalized world.
Absolutely. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is another glaring example. Its punitive treatment of Germany crippled their economy and fueled extremism, setting a precedent for using power to humiliate rather than reconcile, which eventually led to the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Sound familiar? Trump echoes this tactics in his transactional zero sum approach to diplomacy, calling allies delinquent and threatening adversaries with fire and fury. The League of Nations' failure to enforce collective security or address colonialism only deepened the mistrust in international institutions. Fast forward to today, and Trump exploits that skepticism by dismissing organizations like NATO and the UN as obsolete, prioritizing bilateral deals over multilateral cooperations. These historical missteps, rooted in exclusion, exploitation, and the abuse of power, paved the way for a world where a leader like Trump can wield America's dominance as a castle, threatening violence and submission rather than fostering cooperation.
Trump's America currently sends a strong message, and that message is we don't want to take responsibility anymore. But in that case, do you forfeit your de facto leadership role because no responsibilities equals no perks of the job?
Yeah.
And by pushing the system to its breaking point, Trump is inadvertently question mark pushing the world to exit it. America's power grew because the rest of the world allowed it, because it played a role in maintaining stability and leading in a direction that benefits most or the greater good as defined by America. Now, Trump is breaking that implicit agreement, even attempting to hold the world hostage. Remember when he threatened retaliation if countries try to bypass the dollar? It's coercive and it is short-sighted. And eventually, and this to me is what they don't get. It will take time and it will be tough, but everyone else will adapt to a world where the US doesn't want to play ball. And America will unfortunately be the biggest loser.
Exactly, Amina. Trump's belief that America doesn't need the world and the world needs America ignores the deep interdependence of the global economy. The US relies on the rest of the world for critical supply chain, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, you name it. Isolationist policies like tariffs and trade wars disrupt these networks, driving up costs for American consumers and businesses while alienating allies. Protectionism may promise short term gains, but it weakens America's global influence and ceds economic opportunities to rivals like China. Look at post World War II Britain. Its protectionist policies accelerated its decline as a world power, while the US climbed the ladder. Now China is doing the same, slowly but surely.
So when you think about it, Trump is undermining his own ideology. He claims to champion America first, but his actions weaken US global leadership. His populist rhetoric clashes with policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, eroding trust among his working class base by attacking democratic institutions like the judiciary and the press. He undermines the rule of law he claims to uphold, and his divisive rhetoric deepens national fractures. It contradicts his nationalist vision of unity. That's why Project 2025 centralizes power in the executive branch, which contradicts his small government promises. Meanwhile, his alignment with authoritarian leaders like Putin and Netanyahu weakens America's moral authority and global sovereignty. So we can call it a self-sabotaging cycle.
And who has the most to lose in the long run? The elites and the existing power structures. I can go back to your initial analogy with the pre revolutionary France, Amina. The aristocracy thought their privilege was untouchable, but their refusal to address inequalities led to their downfall. Today's elites, billionaires, oligarchs, and institutional powers are playing the same dangerous game. They may benefit in the short term, but in the long term, they risk losing everything: their legitimacy, their power, and their stability. This isn't just a domestic issue, it is a threat to the US global hegemony. Social contracts, the image of America as a beacon of democracy crumbles. Authoritarian regimes like China and Russia are already exploiting this hypocrisy, while allies questioning whether they can rely on a country that is increasingly unstable and inward looking.
And when the social contract breaks, it's not just the marginalized who suffer, it's the entire system. Because historically, civil rights movements fought for inclusion, demanding a seat at the table. That's what things like DEI were for. But as policies continue to reinforce systemic inequalities, the response will inevitably shift. People will no longer be fighting for inclusion. They are going to be fighting to be left alone to build their own system. But what's really unfair here is that that won't be allowed either. And I'll give you an example since I worked in venture capital for a little while. There is a Black women owned fund that was sued by conservative affirmative action activists and lost because they wanted to exclusively fund Black female owned businesses, which is the most discriminated against group of people in the entire universe. And that's not even an exaggeration, unfortunately. So Black women barely get 1% of VC funding, while the majority white cis men owned VCs disproportionately support white founders, and they call it merit based, and they don't write it on their website that they are going to favor white people when they actively do. So this fund that wanted to fight that exclusion was sued for discrimination because you shouldn't back founders based on race. That's just racist. And I feel like we're going to get plenty of similar cases as marginalized communities start to self organize to protect each other and themselves. This hypocrisy exposes the double standard that sustains inequality. When people realize the system isn't designed to include them, but to perpetuate their exclusion, they'll stop seeking participation altogether. They will focus on creating their own systems, networks, and economies. And this shift, it marks a profound turning point, not towards reform, but towards fragmentations, as communities opt out of a system that has long opted out of them.
Yeah, and that's the danger. When the social contract breaks, it doesn't just destabilizes the marginalized, it destabilizes everything. History shows us what happens next. Those who refuse to share power or address injustice are the first to fall when the tide turns, and the tide always turns. We just have to look at all the empires that ever existed.
As we wrap up today's discussion, I want to leave you with with one question. We have many questions, but I want to leave one. Are we heading into a post-empire world? The signs are hard to ignore. The erosion, and I think that's been the word of this podcast, of US hegemony, the rise of multipolarity, and the fragmentation of global systems. But if empires fall, what replaces them? History teaches us that the collapse of empires rarely leads to stability. Think of the fall of Rome, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, or the end of British colonialism. I mean, thank God for that.
Mhm.
Um, each left behind power vacuums, regional conflicts, and decades of instability.
Yeah, a post empire world might mean the end of a signal dominant power, but it doesn't guarantee a fairer or more equitable order. Instead, it could lead to a chaotic scramble for influence where smaller powers and non state actors compete for dominance, and global cooperation becomes even harder to achieve. The question even becomes Can we build a world that prioritizes collective well being over the interests of few?
And if Thomas Sankara was alive today, he would say that we chose champagne for the few over drinking water for most, encapsulating the failure of the current system. Will we continue to cling to the crumbling structure of the empire, or will we dare to imagine something new? A world where stability isn't imposed by a single power, but built through shared responsibility and equity. The choice is always ours, but our generation's time is running out.
It is indeed. Thanks, Amina, and thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us in today's episode of Jetlag Politics. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us to keep the conversation alive.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, please take care, stay curious, and keep questioning the world around you. Bye
Bye.
bye.